Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Philip Pullman's book, Spring-Heeled Jack. Now, I first became interested in Spring-Heeled Jack after seeing an episode of PBS's show Monstrum about him. And he's a complicated cat. So Spring-Heeled Jack, the legend starts in the Regency period in the early 1800s in London. And initially, Jack is this sort of preternatural attacker of women. He's described as having long metal claws, which Pullman does not include. He's extremely tall. He's extremely thin. He dresses aristocratically. He is supposed to be capable of either breathing fire or smoke, and he will sometimes blow fire or smoke into victims' faces. And then the thing that gives him his name is he's supposed to be able to leap over walls or fences or things like this to get into people's gardens and things like this. So that's initially who Spring-Heeled Jack is. He's this almost Jack the Ripper type figure who attacks women in London, particularly working class women. Later on, in the Victorian era, we get a different version of Spring-Heeled Jack, the one that Pullman picks up in his novel. So this is a figure who avenges wrongs and who stands up for the oppressed. So this is more of almost a Batman figure, and actually Pullman makes that comparison in a couple of places. But this is very clearly drawing, it's a children's book, so you don't necessarily want a tall, aristocratic guy with metal claws going around and attempting to assault women. Like, that's not necessarily a great theme for a children's book, so fair play to Pullman for choosing the later incarnation. But he's clearly drawing from this later version where Jack becomes someone who stands up for the poor, stands up for the oppressed, etc., etc. We get that right from the beginning, where we have a sort of preface or prologue called The Legend of Spring-Heeled Jack. It says, in Victorian times, before Superman and Batman had been heard of, there was another hero who used to go around rescuing people and catching criminals. This was Spring-Heeled Jack. No one knew what his real name was. All they knew was that he dressed like the devil, that he could leap over houses with the help of springs in the heels of his boots, and that any evildoer who came up against him met a very unpleasant end. Naturally, a character as mysterious as Spring-Heeled Jack had a lot of stories told about him. And when people heard that Spring-Heeled Jack had been seen, they stayed indoors and didn't look out of their windows, because he might have been a man, but he might not. And some of his deeds were a little too devilish for comfort. So, again, we're starting off with this very positive figure, but also a figure who's an anti-hero. Again, the Batman comparison, which again comes up later on, and actually there's an interesting echo of Batman that I'll talk about in just a minute. That idea of the hero who is potentially a threat, the hero who represents danger, is really central to the novel. Now, Spring-Heeled Jack, the novel itself is actually not that much about the titular character. It's primarily about these three children, Rose, Lily, and Ned Summer. I forget whether their last name is pluralized. I'm not going to be able to find it immediately. Rose, Lily, and Ned, they believe that their father has died in a shipwreck, and so they've been put into this pretty horrendous Victorian orphanage They decide that they're going to escape the orphanage, and they're going to pawn their mother's the gold locket with their mother's picture in it, so that they can pay for passage to America to start a new life. They almost immediately get captured by Mac the Knife, who's the most villainous person in London. Then they sort of get rescued by Spring-Heeled Jack, who's been pursuing Mac the Knife for a good long while. But the children get split up. And then they're pursued by the owners of the orphanage, Mr. Killjoy and Miss Granger. And they want to get the children back. One, to get the locket, because they know it's worth money. And two, because according to the rules, apparently, of the orphanage system, if all the beds aren't filled, they don't get paid. So they go about, and you have various people who try and help the children, various people who try and capture the children, etc., etc. A lot of criminality, a lot of, questionable stuff, people in poverty, etc., etc. And ultimately, what ends up happening is the children's father is not dead. He is actually booking passage on the same ship that the children are trying to get to America to start a new life. Because he's been unable to find them, and so that, he's peacing out again. And so basically, by the end of the novel, Spring-Heeled Jack has returned the children to their father, essentially, by defeating everybody who is a villain of the book, meaning largely Mac the Knife and the superintendents of the orphanage. So again, this is a Spring-Heeled Jack that's very much the later Victorian freer of the oppressed, etc., etc. So when he first meets them, for instance, he tells them, "I'm on your side, my dear. I'm good. I catch villains. I avenge wrongs. I do all kinds of stuff." And then one of the children asks about his costume. And he says, "You like it? Stylish, eh? I wear it to remind evildoers of what lies ahead of them." So again, this is a very much Batman-type situation. And we actually get that later on. We get a very interesting bit with Mac the Knife, who's kidnapped Ned, and basically is holding him for ransom, because he wants the two girls to, Mac the Knife wants the two girls to give him the locket. So, in order to try and bargain for his life, when Spring-Heeled Jack shows up, Mac the Knife offers a bet that they will tell each other the most evil deed that they've ever done, and whoever's deed is more evil will win. Spring-Heeled Jack agrees to this, though he has no particularly good reason to. And then it says, this is Ned and his dog Spangle, who are both sort of captured. Then they heard a whispering from next door, like rats' feet pattering over bones. Silence. And then a cry of, "Oh no, what a tale of evil, wicked, wicked." But whose voice was it? Ned couldn't tell. And then came more whispering, like the sound of a ghost brushing its long dead hair in a dusty mirror. Silence. Then, "No, no, no, I can't bear it. It's too evil for words. I'm done for. Horrible, horrible, horrible." But whose voice was it? Ned still couldn't tell. And then there came a lifeless thump as someone fell to the floor, and then a slow dragging noise, and then, after a long time, a far distant splash in the river below. Gulp, thought Ned. Spangle's hair bristled all over, and she gave a tiny howl. She couldn't help it. Then came a creak as the door opened, and a long shadow fell across the floor. So Spring-Heeled Jack basically, we think at this stage that Spring-Heeled Jack has killed Mac the Knife by telling him about an evil deed. which is an interesting approach to defeating a villain. But Mac the Knife is not dead. He's just dumped in the river. Because when Spring-Heeled Jack and Ned and Spangle leave the warehouse, we learn that whatever it was that Spring-Heeled Jack had told him, it hadn't been enough to finish Mac off. His leathery old soul had been scorched a bit, but the water must have cooled him down because he came crawling out as evil as ever and thirsting for revenge. Spangle and Ned attack Mac the Knife, at which point Spring-Heeled Jack, and this is a very Batman thing from like the old Batman comics from like the 60s and stuff. Spring-Heeled Jack basically ties him up upside down and hangs him from a pulley for the police to find. So, I mean, this is ultimately Mac the Knife's fate, is he gets suspended upside down over the river, basically to await the police. And again, it's very much this sort of traditional superhero, I'm not going to kill the villain, I'm going to leave them for the police type thing. So we have that element of it. The other thing that's worth talking about with this, apart from the character of Spring-Heeled Jack, who I think is very, very interesting, is the actual narrative style of this book, because it's a mixed media sort of book. And you can see this right from the first couple of pages. So this is the beginning of chapter 1, and we've got several elements going on here. We've got some incidental drawings, like this one over here, or this little fellow right here. Things that aren't crucial to the plot, but they help develop the feel of it. They help us figure out what we should be imagining. Then we've got actual proper prose. And this is where a lot of the story gets developed. But we've also got these comic book or graphic novel style panels. And the story itself, the narrative of this book is developed through these different techniques. We have that mix of prose and comic book panels. And it's really, really interesting as a technique because the prose gives Pullman a lot of space to tell us what's going on, what characters are thinking, what they're feeling, what their concerns are, etc., etc. Whereas the graphic novel panels not only help us visualize these characters and sort of understand the situation, the scenario that they're in, it also helps keep the reader engaged. Because, I mean, that's what visuals do, right? Is when you have imagery within a text, it hooks our attention again. So having those two different elements working in harmony throughout this narrative is a really, really effective technique. The other thing that we get at the beginning of each chapter, we get an epigraph. So in this case, it was a dark and stormy night, attributed to Alexander Dumas in The Three Musketeers. And then, yeah, there we go. The text itself, the chapter itself, starts with a variation of the epigraph. So it was a dark and stormy night. This one is just a straight up usage of it, but often they Pullman makes slight changes. So, for instance, with chapter 2, the epigraph is "Meanwhile back at the ranch," attributed to A. Western. And then the chapter opens with "Meanwhile back at the orphanage." So we've got that slight revision to make meaningful the epigraph for this particular book. And the thing is, a lot of them are drawn from Victorian literature, Victorian novels, or from spooky stories, scary stories. So we've got those those illusions or those elements brought in. But there's one that I especially like, which is the epigraph for chapter 11, which is "Meanwhile Back at the Orphanage," and it's attributed to Philip Pullman in the novel Spring-Heeled Jack. And as we just saw, actually, chapter 2 begins with the phrase "Meanwhile Back at the Orphanage," but so does chapter 11. So in this case, rather than taking an epigraph from a different source, from a different Victorian novel or scary story or whatever it is, Pullman is self-consciously drawing from his own novel. So I think that's a really brilliant small touch. I like it very much. And again, it's an interesting book. There's I do think something is lost when we take Spring-Heeled Jack to be kind of a hero, but Pullman does a good job signaling to us that this is a complicated hero. This is not Superman, who's just sort of always ethically good. This is more of a Batman figure. And actually that ambiguity for a children's story, I think, is really, really important because it helps start developing critical thinking abilities.